thank you so much, Mr. Kawasaki, for giving us a very brief but general overview of the years and years of good work that you've been doing in both Peace Boat and also ICAN. So I guess I think we're today in a very safe environment to really think about what this really means to the contemporary 21st century. So if you don't mind, may I start with a little story? So when I was a doctoral student, I spent 2 to 3 years studying in Japan. And at the time, my study interest was wartime literature, especially doing comparative studies of some Chinese writers writing about war and Japanese writers writing about war. And I was living in Japan, doing my research, having a great time. And one day, I came back to Taipei to visit my parents, and I was invited to a dinner banquet with what I call all the adults. And at the banquet, there was a really like a very well-respected senior lady who was a writer. And she just asked me, so Mei, what are you studying in Japan? I said, oh, you know, I'm looking into a number of Japanese writers who lived in China during the wartime. There was one writer named Hayashi Kyoko who was a child when her family moved to Manchuria at the time under the government expedition. And she lived through her childhood years in Manchuria and then got repatriated back to Japan, to Nagasaki, and experienced atomic bombing. So throughout the rest of her writing career, she was really struggling between these experiences of, you know, as Japanese in Japan, they were quote-unquote victimizers. And then coming back to Japan, she became one of the victims of the atomic bomb dropping. I was just narrating this my PhD thesis, and suddenly this lady, just well-respected senior, just said, what is there to talk about Japanese being victims? You have no idea what they have done to China. And she was about to spend the rest of the dinner banquet telling me and re-educating me about history. And I remember when I was sitting there having done 2 to 3 years of research and suddenly be reduced to this moment of, I feel a little bit ashamed. And I feel speechless as to how I can stand up against someone who had actually gone through that experience of war. I can approach it from a theoretical standpoint, academic standpoint, because I'm the younger generation, but what did I know? So I guess I maybe be speaking for many of us sitting here today, as if anyone has studied Chinese history, I grew up thinking the dropping of the atomic bomb was a savior of our nation, savior of the Chinese race. Really, without it, more and more people are going to suffer. Until years and years later, I went to America, completely undergone a different kind of historical education. Then I learned the other side of the story. And even till today, it is hard for me to mediate between both sides of the story. And earlier you mentioned about the human faces. And I remember the sense of shame or the sense of littleness that I had in front of this senior lady who had gone through that wartime experience, as well as the Japanese writer that I had studied who had gone through these atrocities. So my question is, how do we mediate? How do we really bring the idea of peace back to a place where everyone can really start to feel comfortable, not to feel either guilty, maybe from the Japanese side, or a little bit ashamed from the victim side? How do you do that? How do you do that in your effort?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a very important and interesting question. I think in such a environment like Peace Boat, where many students, people from various parts of the world sit together and discuss such matter is really important and help. Meaning that, you know, I'm from Japan, and if I'm sitting in front of a Korean person, just bilaterally, and discuss the matter regarding atomic bombing or World War II, then it should be always very much nationalistic discussion. You know, it can't be avoided. But by having various people and to sit together and to look at the issue from the global perspective. That helps, and that provides us to constructive discussion in pursuit of a solution for today. And this does not mean that as a Japanese citizen, the issue related to the responsibility to the past will never, how to say, disappear. We have to, the Japanese citizens have to be mindful of that and also keep on working on that. It will not change. But at the same time, we shouldn't contain the discussion regarding the wars and weapons in such nationalistic framework. And some sort of global solution will be very important. I know by traveling around the world with those survivors, it's always really difficult to have a discussion with neighbors of Japan. Closer, more difficult. It's a really common phenomenon, and it relates to the fact that the country of Japan has not been sufficiently dealt with the matter for the past, for which all Japanese citizens, including myself, have some responsibility. So it's a big task. At the same time, let me repeat that global setting for a global solution is really key.
So thank you very much. So if I were to also push the question a little bit more, some people also argue and say that, well, sometimes war or conflict or a certain kind of violent means is not the best solution, but it could be a necessary or lesser evil to counter or to overcome or to defeat the absolute evil, right? And this is usually a very common kind of argument, in the moral theories of, justify war and whatnot. I want to hear about your opinion on that, and I want to maybe share with the audience, in the 2017 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, I think Setsuko Thurlow, who was one of the victims of the atomic bomb dropping, had this very, I think, humanistic passage in saying that, she said that when I remember Hiroshima, the first image that comes to mind is my 4-year-old nephew, Eiji. Okay, his little body transformed into an unrecognizable, melted chunk of flesh, I think because of the heat, right? He kept begging for water in a faint voice until his death released him from agony, which means he died, right? And then I guess the takeaway message that Ms. Thurlow wants to say is these weapons they could never be necessary evil. They're the ultimate evil. However, I think that the moral dilemma is that sometimes when evil combating evil, is there such a thing called necessary or lesser evil? Is there something that's permissible? And you probably encountered this question a lot in your effort towards peace education. And how do you respond to that?
So the Setsuko's approach, talking about his own nephew as an example, is so powerful in drawing attention to each individual. In the other case, Setsuko has a long yellow banner type of thing, where all the names of 341 schoolmates who passed away due to the bombing from her own school. Those 341 names, very long banner, and she carries always in her public lecture. and show it. So humanitarian approach means that looking at those each individuals and the lives and stories about it, you know. And I know that the wars are sometimes kind of justified in the theoretical debate. But please, I would like to think of, please, how to say, what winning a war would mean. In history textbook in the Roman Empire in the ancient world, country A wages war and wins country B, you know? But especially today, with nuclear weapons exist, what winning a war means, you know? So, and by having the reality in mind, those theory to justify fighting violence in the eve of war would be naturally challenged. And that's the challenge that each one of you need to have in mind in challenging all those international issues.
So, I mean, and if we're to bring this big question, right, the historical lessons and the geopolitical politics down to more of a home level, I know that today you really want to address to probably the younger audience in our crowd as well, because we're looking at 21st century. If I may share a little bit of my personal observation, I feel that in our current century, let's say in a place like Taiwan, as I mentioned earlier in the opening, that we generally live in a very peaceful society. War is something so far away from us. But I feel that this idea of conflict or violence is changing its own nature. So I call it the changing faces of violence, in the sense that, like earlier, because you mentioned there's a human face, like in the previous time you can see the human face. But interestingly, perhaps in the current or the younger generation, a lot of the conflict and tension comes online, which means that the faces are unknown, identities are unknown. There is anonymous existence of many different people uttering different kinds of opinions and views. And so if the previous century is more like institution to institutional violence, country to country, corporations to corporations, I feel that we're kind of down to a level perhaps personal to personal, where you can social media groups versus social media groups. So in this kind of like anonymity, so anonymous identity, how do you combat violence? How do you promote peace? And is technology actually making things worse? Is it, or is it actually become, it can be a very convenient tool for us to promote more of peace education?
So, taking the example of Peace Boat, it's a very unique place for training offline. On the ship, yeah, we have some internet connection, but it's very limited. And you have to live together. If you're on the ship, you cannot escape. You know, if you escape, then it will be disastrous. And sometimes we invite people from conflict areas, for example, from Israel and Palestine, or from different ethnic groups from within Sri Lanka. Intentionally, we invite those people from different conflicting groups and ask them to live together. And at the beginning, it's sometimes, for example, for Israeli and Palestinian students, it's really difficult to shake hands even. But as a matter of fact, many family members have been killed, or very, very difficult story exists. So we have to respect that tension or that kind of a feeling. But the days go on, and they have some discussion and seminars, and human interaction make people's bond stronger. So today's violence, including international and interstate violence, have been generated and promoted through online speeches, hate speeches, or like a provocation and so on. And I think you've been experiencing that the online anonymous speeches can very easily be used just for the provocation. And that provocation is really good for market, because if you get good number of likes, then it will make benefit, right? So there is a business for that. So you need to have some sort of resilience and some different alternative approach of communication. So get trained in the offline, person-to-person communication and skill is really important. So in doing so, the Peace Boat is putting importance on the feeling, how you feel, you know. It's a very important part of Peace Boat activities. For the knowledge you can get from internet, even photos you can get from Instagram, but feeling you cannot properly get without having a direct interaction or visiting and so on. So this feeling part is so crucial.
So I think you're referring to empathy, right? How do you empathize deeply with the experience of someone, even though maybe you haven't actually experienced it yourself, right? So to go simply from sympathy to empathy. And I think that is a big question, I think, in the educational field. How do we teach students empathy? Has anybody here taken a course called Empathy? Literally raise your hand, because I would like to talk to you, and I'll steal your syllabus and teach it back in Hong Kong. I'm in the School of Humanities, and I haven't known any colleagues who are teaching empathy, but this is starting to be a rising question that a lot of us are asking. How do we teach students to, not just to know, as you mentioned, on the head knowledge, but to feel how others have gone through? So, and I think, so some people propose that, okay, let's do storytelling. All right, so I think that's exactly what you're doing. You're bringing the previous victims or the people who suffer through war, whether it's regardless from which side. It could be the comfort women from Korea, or it could be, you know, victim, the hibakusha from Japan. But I also sometimes feel that with storytelling, it is also easy to go towards this direction of accusations or blame, or potentially being utilized. So people would tell a very sad story of someone who suffered from something, and therefore as a way to justify a particular cause. And more dangerously, perhaps, to be hijacked by politics or political kind of discourse. So how do you manage that balance between storytelling and staying focused on the humanitarian, kind of like that humanistic feelings, versus being used towards another political goal?
Yeah, for that part, I'm really grateful for those atomic bombing survivors, hibakushas in Japan, those who have been in the frontier of the movement to abolish nuclear weapons, because their main call has consistently been as the in working to not repeat the same mistake, rather to retaliate or kind of counterattack or something like that, you know. I have a very interesting experience in almost 20 years ago in India, when Peace Boat docked in India. We had a poster exhibition session of the photos of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the Indian people, to the Indian people. And some of them came to us, oh, it's deadly weapons and very strong weapons. That is why I support the Indian government decision to have nuclear weapons.
To use against the Pakistani.
Yeah. So that was right after India and Pakistan conducted nuclear tests. So, yeah, sometimes, depending on how you present the issue, the same fact can be used in a different direction.
So how did you respond to that comment?
I think I talked to them about the personal stories in details that I heard from the survivors and how they're even suffering today, even after 60 or 70 years and so on. So, looking back at the history of Japan, if people were not wise, maybe Japan or Japanese survivors might have gone to a campaign to arm Japan with nuclear weapons to deter a future attack and so on. But luckily, we did not, and for that, I'm really grateful for those the leaders of the survivors to have led the campaign in the reasonable direction. This is a disastrous experience for everyone, not for only Japanese, for everyone. That is why we need to make worldwide efforts to eliminate these deadly weapons. So that aspect is really, really important, and at the same time, we know if it is only Japanese people to talk about of the disaster. That is why Japanese survivors are working together with Tahitians or Marshall Islanders, who have suffered similarly from nuclear weapons, and to make it global, and to make it global voices for a global call. I think that has been a practice, and that's the way that we need to continue to go for.